Chapter 2: The Long Roots of Venezuela's Communal Tradition. Socialist communes may be new in Venezuela, officially. They began no earlier than 2009, but, like much that is new, they also rely on old traditions and thus connect with past social formations. On a certain level, it is hardly surprising that overcoming the radical atomization and isolated individuality of capitalist society could be inspired by elements of past social formations, inasmuch as these latter, especially those dating from prehistory, were overwhelmingly communitarian. However, much of the Marxist left has fallen into the trap of thinking that a socialist future will be generated, if not ex nihilo, at least without much reference to past epochs and their social forms. In defense of this latter approach, one can appeal to Marx himself, who wrote that bourgeoisie revolutions appeal to history, to smother their own content. But proletarian revolutions take their poetry from the future. This statement is no outlier. In fact, the young Marx generally assumed that capitalism would simply erase and overcome earlier forms of domination. This overly sanguine, essentially progressive view of capitalism surely played a role in the young Marx's taking distance from such earlier social formations. He looked to them mostly for what they might reveal to the investigator when juxtaposed to capitalism, but he thought of them very little in terms of models. As we shall see, Marx later revised this idea, coming to embrace the relevance of communitarian traditions, past and present, for the socialist future. And he began to see pre-capitalist social formations as genuine assets in socialist construction. However, this shift in Marxist thought in relation to pre-capitalist societies is not well known, and it has not kept most Marxists and the bulk of the socialist movement from radically downplaying the importance of our various communitarian histories. Latin America may be an exception to this general theoretical trend, for the simple reason that the continent's past weighs so heavily on its present. This is in part because of the radical expressions of uneven and combined development that occur in such dependent countries, which allow pre-capitalist formations to survive and thus encourage many political movements to appeal to them. In Venezuela, some academics and revolutionaries have argued for the pertinence of the region's communal past and the communitarian practices that survive there today to the project of socialist construction. Among the most distinguished of these theorists, anthropologists Iraida Vargas and Mario Sanoja, who have claimed that both Venezuela's history and its long-standing cultural traditions could be the basis of the Bolivarian process's development of communal socialism. For this reason, it is important to consider the profound links that this pair of researchers has uncovered between the future that the Bolivarian Revolution aspires to and its roots in a society whose practices of solidarity and deep-seated conceptions of equality are often shaped by indigenous and African traditions. Their arguments, sketched below, coincide both with the multilinear approach to historical development that Marx finally espoused, and with some subaltern theoretical Marxian currents in Latin America. Incan communism. In Latin American Marxist theory, the first great, and still the most famous, blast from the past came from Peruvian Marxist José Carlos Mariátegui. In 1928, he published his watershed work, 7 Interpretive Essays on Peruvian Reality. This work went against the grain of socialist thought at the time. While most of Marxism was riding high on the workers' victory in the incipient USSR, and had its gaze directed toward the final struggle that would usher in the glorious communist future, Mariátegui cast his vision toward the past of his Andean country. His creative approach to Marxism sent shockwaves through the consensus of the Third International, which in a Eurocentric way had determined that Latin America's semi-feudal societies had nothing to offer the socialist project. For his part, Mariátegui was, in his own words, a convinced and confessed Marxist. However, he was unable to accept the Third International's rote rejection of Latin America's past. Instead, he argued that the collective nature of Incan society, especially the lack of private property and land, represented a communist past in the Andean region that, far from being dead, constituted a living legacy that could inspire present and future post-capitalist constructions. Mariátegui's essay, The Problem of the Land, which appears third in the 7 Essays collection, presents this claim clearly. There he wrote that liberal-style land reform in Peru, which some called for at the time, was not the solution for overcoming the latifundio and indigenous servitude in his country. He thought that the historical moment to divide the land into small parcels had passed. Instead, an overtly socialist and collective solution was possible and even necessary because of the undeniable and concrete factor which gives its peculiar character to our agrarian problem, the survival of the community and of elements of a practical socialism in indigenous agriculture and life. Mariátegui's idea, and by community he was referring to indigenous ayllus, was there was enough alive of what he called Incan communism to pursue a collective approach to land reform. In effect, the pre-colonial past and its forms of land tenure could be reactivated in the present to construct a socialist future. This claim of Mariátegui flew in the face of Eurocentric Marxist currents, whose proponents saw Incan civilizations as merely a local variant of feudalism. Yet, Mariátegui's approach did resonate with a widespread cultural tendency that existed in Europe and elsewhere, Romanticism. In Michael Lowy's words, Romanticism is essentially a cultural protest against modern capitalist civilization based on social, cultural, political, or religious values that are pre-capitalist or pre-modern or pre-industrial. This kind of romanticism is widespread in Latin America, where the ghosts of the past, Simón Bolívar, José Martí, Emiliano Zapata, Huaycaipuro, often seem more alive than the wan politics of the living. Revolutionaries often invoke these figures in struggles against capitalism and imperialism in the region. However, in Mariátegui's case, a commitment to historical materialism, a result of his embracing of Marxism while living in Italy in the 1920s, gave his approach to the continent's past a more robust and scientific character. Hence, with one eye on the past and another on the present, Mariátegui understood communism to be not only an existential issue of the continent. Only a socialist Latin America could stand up to a capitalist North America, he wrote. But he also saw it as one that had connections reaching far into the past. The Last Marx and the Russian Commune. Mariátegui's unorthodox views led to heated debates with the more dogmatic theorists in the Third International, who contended that Latin America's underdeveloped countries, mired in feudal forms, could only aspire to a stage of capitalist development in the short and even middle term. These theorists invoked Marx to defend this doctrine, stagist position. Still, unbeknownst to them, Mariátegui's thinking resonated with the direction taken by Marx's mature thought, especially the work of so-called Last Marx, on the issue of the relevance of communitarian life forms to socialism. This is a part of Marx's life and production that has only come to light recently, thanks to studies such as those of Theodor Shannon, Kevin Anderson, and Marcelo Musto. What we know now is that after publishing Capital, Volume 1 in 1867, Marx continued to investigate insatiably, casting his attention toward the periphery of capitalism, and also assimilating the findings brought by social science's recent discovery of prehistory. The new field of prehistory, which revealed that humanoids had lived on the earth for millions of years, had an enormous impact on how human life and human development were viewed at the time, not the least because it opened a window on what came to be called primitive communism. Marx also began to study Russia in detail in the 1870s, even learning the language. He had a particular interest in Russian forms of land tenure, including the survival of the peasant commune in that country, and he began communicating with Russian intellectuals and militants. One of these was the former populist Vera Zasulich. Zasulich had become famous for attempting to assassinate a Tsarist official before co-founding the Marxist Emancipation of Labor group with Georgy Plekhanov. She wrote to Marx in 1881 about the controversial issue of the Russian peasant commune, the Obshchina, asking whether it could be an asset in constructing socialism, as some Russian populists argued, or whether it would simply have to disappear, making way for a long stage of capitalist development. Zasulich might have thought that, given Marx's earlier defense of progressive development through capitalism, even when brought about by colonialists, he would acknowledge the need for the peasant commune to disappear. Yet Marx's thinking, perhaps under the influence of the Paris Commune, 1871, was now going in a different direction. His historiography had taken a distinctly romantic turn from the mid-1850s forward. For Marx now, pre-capitalist social formations were no longer seen as simply dead and irretrievable, and the egalitarian and more sustainable relations in many indigenous societies interested him greatly. Human development, instead of being linear and progressive, was, in this new view, more like a curved circuit, in which the communal forms embodied in pre-capitalist social formations could potentially touch off and ignite the future. In this spirit, in composing his various drafts to Zasulich, Marx came to affirm that Russia's old-fashioned peasant communes were not necessarily doomed to disappear, but could instead be a fulcrum of social regeneration, and a direct starting point of the system to which contemporary society strives. Backtracking on what he had claimed earlier in Capital 1, that the more industrially developed country only shows to the less developed the image of its own future, Marx was now suggesting that less developed societies might hold a few lessons of their own for the future, particularly regarding their communal forms. Importantly, he pointed out that the historical sequence of modes of production he had discussed in Capital and elsewhere was confined to the countries of Western Europe, and he believed in no one-size-fits-all historico-philosophical theory. Marx's letter and drafts to Zasulich were lost and would only be discovered in 1911. It was David Ryazanov, the outstanding director of the Marx-Engels Institute, who found them. Yet the letters remained unpublished until 1924. Not surprisingly, in a Soviet Union where a modernizing stagist Marx was becoming something of a religion, this alternative and romantic vision of Marx generated little enthusiasm. Caribbean anarchism. Despite having little access to the writings of the last Marx, Marxists in Latin America were forced early on to reckon with the revolutionary potential of their own communitarian traditions, and also with the emancipatory aspects of historical memory. Theorists in the region were embedded in situations that were amenable to this line of thought, inasmuch as wherever capitalism is an outside imposition, popular culture tends to defend regional tradition in the face of foreign aggressors. Whatever the reasons, this past-oriented romantic vision is widespread in the continent's Marxism. It existed in Peru, as we've seen with Mariátegui's work, and it also had expressions in Cuba, where the philosopher and historian Fernando Martínez Heredia argued that the Cuban Revolution of 1959 had deep roots in 19th and early 20th century movements for emancipation. Similar claims are also being made in Venezuela today. Venezuela's pre-colonial past is less known and less studied than the Andean civilizations of the Incas or that of the Aztecs in what is today Mexico. Nevertheless, The decentralized and horizontally structured indigenous societies that existed, and in important cases still exist, in much of Venezuela's territory deserve careful attention because they provide potential bases for a socialist future, and especially for the communal construction of a post-capitalist society. This is the most important argument of the Venezuelan anthropologists Iraida Vargas and Mario Sanoja. It grows organically out of their earlier research. Sanoja, who died in 2022, was best known for his investigations into agrarian practices in what he called the North of South America. That research is summarized in a small book titled Los Hombres de la Yuca y el Maíz, 1977, which highlights the importance of viticulture, the cultivation of roots rather than grains, in shaping pre-colonial indigenous communities in much of what is today Venezuela. To write this epoch-making book, Sanoja had to cast off the yoke of what could be facetiously called Mexican cultural hegemony, as expressed in the idea that Latin Americans are essentially people of corn. The problem with that idea is that it underplays the critical role of viticulture, not only of potatoes in the Andes, but of yucca in what is much of Venezuela and Brazil. Yucca is a crop that requires relatively little attention, allows for long-term storage in the ground, and, in its bitter form, is highly imperishable. Its cultivation went hand in hand with a specific kind of social formation, communities that were decentralized and mostly horizontal, with only temporary leaderships. Sanoja called these formations autarkic and politically independent. In short, they were anarchists. For anyone who has lived some time in Venezuela, it is easy to believe the formation influence of this indigenous inheritance, characterized by horizontality and independence, on the country and its cultures. On the one hand, there are the egalitarian social practices that operate in the communities of Warao, Yukpa, Wayu, Cariña, Yanomami, Pemon, and other indigenous peoples that maintain their cultural identity and regional autonomy. On the other hand, the effects of such traditions and values extend widely into the society, even permeating urban popular culture. One surprising expression of this legacy is seen in Venezuela's complex attitude toward their leaders, Hugo Chavez included, to whom they pay allegiance to carry out specific tasks, but at the same time treat with a gratifying familiarity most of the time, just as one person among many in the collective. Then there are the collective egalitarian labor practices, cayapas, that are assumed with great enthusiasm and can be intense, lasting for days, along with the widespread practice of organizing collective soup meals called sancochos. All this is to say that Vargas and Sanoja, in their various works that defend the importance of Venezuelan traditions in building a new communal world, were theorizing based on what one can see before one's eyes in the country and in its diverse cultures. A very long revolution. Though their intellectual trajectory dates back well into the 20th century, Vargas and Sanoja both became enthusiastic Chavistas. Hence, when the late Hugo Chavez proposed the communal path to socialism in 2009, they began to scour the country's prehistoric and historic past for precedents to the project of communal socialism. The anthropologist couple is profoundly influenced by historians of the French Annales school, who gave importance to the sociological dimensions of history and employed the perspective of the longue durée. This intellectual training prepared them to chart the relevance of Venezuela's communal traditions as they survive in specific locations and in everyday culture to the work of building the socialist communal future. With a nod to Maoism, they titled their resulting work La Larga Marcha hacia la Sociedad Comunal, 2017. The book has two main themes. On the one hand, it looks at how the hidden nation, made up of impoverished, racialized masses, has pushed forward an emancipatory project for more than 2 centuries, issuing into the Bolivarian Revolution today. On the other hand, it addresses how Venezuela's current socialist project can be based on communitarian traditions derived from diverse practices and attitudes still persisting in the society. This may seem an excessively general argument, but it translates into some specific concrete claims about regions and projects in Venezuela. For example, the authors point out how in central western Lara state, where some of Venezuela's most important communes exist today, there was once a huge indigenous civilization that had developed proto-state structures and wide-ranging territorial control. These were the Caquetío people, and part of their legacy consists of deep-rooted communitarian traditions, including a vast system of cooperatives of weavers and pottery makers that exchanged their goods in the zone. For Sanoja and Vargas, it is easy to draw a line from that past civilization to the communal present in the region, where strong community organizations such as Seco Se Sola, Plan Pueblo a Pueblo, and El Maizal figure prominently. If this appears to be a radical form of historical telescoping, the argument is nevertheless backed up by the existence of enduring production practices aimed at satisfying society's necessities, which the researcher pair calls the true social cement that in the last instance supports the revolutionary or counter-revolutionary imagery of social collectives. Another concrete example of how their argument plays out is found in the 23 de Enero barrio of Caracas, where powerful organizations such as La Piedrita, Alexis Vive, El Panel Commune, and Coordinadora Simón Bolívar are flourishing. Vargas and Sanoja argue that the communitarian traditions that operate in that barrio are derived from the largely Afro-Venezuelan populations that settled there some 70 years ago. Such communities draw from the long tradition of Maroon resistance and practices of self-governance developed by Venezuelan Afro-descended people in their long-standing efforts to maintain cultural identity, freedom, and egalitarian social relations in the face of enduring discrimination and exclusion. The communities in 23 de Enero are close-knit without the atomization found in many urban centers around the world. For example, the Catholic religious festivals there show diverse African influences, while functioning to maintain community cohesion and sometimes even promote revolutionary ideology. Security is also under community control. In many sectors of the barrio, the police do not enter, but order is maintained by community organizations. In recent decades, confirming Vargas and Sanoja's general thesis, one can see how even the social peace maintained by the barrio's grassroots colectivos, self-organized urban groups, has begun to take on a socialist character, with their leaders assuming revolutionary positions. See Chapter 8. History from below. Another theoretical influence on the anthropologist couple is English Marxist historian E.P. Thompson, who figures in their bibliographies along with Marc Bloch and Fernand Braudel of the Annales School. That is because Vargas and Sanoja's work connects with Thompson's thesis that the working masses are not a passive product of the capitalist productive apparatus, which spits out a generic bourgeoisie on one end and a generic proletariat on the other, but rather these masses produce themselves as a class, projecting futures and even new forms of societal organization. Generic or abstract working classes, which exist only on paper, may seem short on ideas for how to construct the future. However, actually existing working classes in Venezuela and elsewhere are steeped in historical memory and usually aspire to civilizational projects that are cobbled together from elements of the known, that is, from old social forms and collective memory, but even so contain an emancipatory dimension because the values they express were developed over time as part of the culture of the oppressed. In the Venezuelan case, there is a 500-year-old history of resistance to class and neo-colonial oppression. Rebellions of diverse kinds took place long before the independence wars against the Spanish metropolis set off an ongoing class struggle that persists up to the present. This much is well-traveled territory and investigated by many anthropologists and historians. However, what Vargas and Senoja wish to highlight in relation to future socialist constructions is that these earlier rebellions were not merely spontaneous actions, but rather rich in pragmatic content, projecting alternative forms of government and society. For example, some of the revolts of enslaved people aspired to create kingdoms that had decidedly utopian dimensions, envisioning multicultural coexistence with Creole settlers, whereas others, such as the heroic rebellion led by José Leonardo Chirino in Coro, were likely inspired by the emancipatory project of the Haitian Revolution, as well as by communal traditions from West and Central Africa. Also of great relevance were the 19th century mass movements, most notably the one led by Ezequiel Zamora, that took the European idea of federalism and, in a paradoxical way, filled it with an anti-oligarchical content. Insofar as these diverse historical struggles continue to shape Venezuelan society, Vargas and Senoja are able to bring a novel perspective to the circles of Chavista intellectuality. Their view, inspired by the tradition of popular historiography, is that the Bolivarian Revolution and its current commune-based strategy is the culmination of a series of struggles and aspirations reaching back at least half a millennium in the region. The historical current. This thesis about the relevance of the past to contemporary socialism in Venezuela receives support from the most diverse quarters. An important, if surprising one, comes from the experience of the Venezuelan guerrilla. The armed movement was born in the early 1960s as the Venezuelan Communist Party fell under extreme persecution. Its militants, despite the university context from which most were drawn, came to know the rural communities and their belief systems well during their almost 2 decades of clandestine struggle. After their military defeat in the late 1970s, the Venezuelan guerrilla changed methods of struggle for more long-term, community-based ones. At about the same time, they began to refer to the continuity of struggles that reached from deep in Venezuelan history to the present as the historical current. Their claim was inspired by what they had seen firsthand. For example, in one of the mountainous regions where the guerrilla melded best with the communities and lasted longest, there is a legacy of enduring indigenous and maroon resistance. This territory includes the mountains of Yaracuy and Lara, where Miguel de Boria led a rebellion of enslaved people beginning in the mid-16th century, forming common cause with the Hirahara nation that the Spanish could not dominate. Their struggle lasted more than 75 years, with indigenous and Afro-descended people together consolidating a large liberated area, a self-governed maroon community, which Venezuelans called a cumbe. Eventually, the Spanish throne, outfought and outwitted, had no choice but to recognize this territory as an independent political entity. The memory of this anti-colonial struggle persists in local legends, the best known of which figures the partner of Miguel de Boria as Maria Leonza, an indigenous chiefess who rides a tapir. This maroon community would go on holding the land in common and having its own internal governance. However, they had a serious setback when a 19th century judge, Fernando Espinal, declared the inhabitants to be mere campesinos, or peasants, thus ending their legal status as an indigenous reserve. This opened the doors to private ownership. In higher altitude zones which were suitable for coffee growing, the Jimenez family entered, holding much of the land during the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. The towns in that zone still bear the name of their coffee plantations. Buenos Aires, Copey, etc. Somewhat later, large swaths of the lower lying lands came under control of Cuban sugar planters who had been displaced by the 1959 revolution. In both places, the original inhabitants were reduced to day laborers who worked on the plantations of the oligarchical landlords. Yet the tradition of resistance and the memory of the struggle continued. For example, at one point in the mid-1980s, a group of politically conscious student activists joined forces with farm workers to occupy a large tract of land in the Los Cañizos Palo Quemao hacienda, where the Bolivarian Revolution, with its 2001 land law, gave further impetus to efforts to recover the land, opening the door for more grassroots land occupations, often by the very descendants of those who had lived in the earlier Maroon community, and more liberated territory. This allowed for the formation of cooperatives, which benefited from state-supplied farm machinery, and it later opened the way for the construction of socialist communes, such as the Ali Primera and Hugo Chavez communes, now thriving in Urachiche. The historical line that reaches, more or less without break, from the region liberated by Miguel de Buria's followers and their Hirahara allies among the hundreds of self-governed cumbes that were once sown across the Venezuelan territory, forming powerful inter-ethnic resistance systems to Bolivarian cooperatives and communes today, is the best proof for the existence of a historical current. However, the evidence that past struggles are a living and charged legacy is obvious to any visitor of Yaracuy today. That is because when approaching Yaracuy's capital city, San Felipe, one encounters numerous outsized statues of saints and virgins that line the roadway like concrete sentinels. This itself is present-day evidence of the struggle, for these statues are part of the ideological campaign against indigenous resistance. The other side of the coin, the symbols of rebellion that form the counterpoint to these Christian icons, are the syncretic altars that exist in the nearby mountains, rendering homage to Maria Leonza, Miguel de Buria, Simón Bolívar, and now Hugo Chavez. Just as Afro-descendant and indigenous people fought together for centuries to maintain or recover their land from the onslaught of colonists and oligarchical landlords, so the spiritual avatars of each side go on being deployed to win over the hearts and minds for one camp or the other in this ongoing class war. The once and future commune. The truth is that any given society, far from being a tabula rasa, is a rich palimpsest made up of many elements from the living past. This is what Vargas and Sanoja, on the one hand, and the Venezuelan guerrilla, on the other, discovered. Chavez himself was aware of this fact. In Aló Presidente Teórico Número Uno, where Chavez opened a whole new epoch of socialist construction with his assertion that the commune is the space in which socialism will be born. He also referred to the importance of indigenous societies in both Venezuela and in the South American continent more generally to building socialist communes in contemporary times. To this effect, he brandished and quoted a book he had read in his youth about the socialism of the Incas, Luis Baudin's El Imperio Socialista de los Incas. The key point is that the spaces of Venezuelan society should not be seen in abstract terms, but instead as concrete and varied formations that are traversed by diverse cultural codes with long-standing patterns of behavior. As far as socialist construction is concerned, the most important features in this sense are that, along with surviving indigenous communities which already embody many socialist values, the country's social fabric contains practices of communitarian coexistence, varied forms of social solidarity, and, above all, many surviving expressions of egalitarian social relations. This living legacy has a relevance that goes beyond the micro level of the isolated cumbe or community, For the indigenous and Afro-Venezuelan inheritance includes the possibility of reactivating an alternative geometry of power based on pre-colonial and maroon networks that once existed throughout the territory, but could be revived and adapted in the process of building socialism. Both the civilization of the Caquetío, who had a network reaching out into the Caribbean islands, and the collaboration between indigenous and Afro-descendant maroon communities in resistance provide potential models for a future confederation of self-organized communities. This possibly jives with the vision endorsed by most supporters of Venezuela's communal movement, who believe that the socialist future in Venezuela should be based on a network of communal organizations that cooperatively produce to satisfy their own collective needs and share their surpluses with other organized communities through a widening web of non-market relations based on solidarity. Such a vision is not strictly anti-statist, but rather posits the Venezuelan state as initially coexisting in a dialectical relation with a plurality of self-organized communes. Later, as the transition process advances, the state will be transcended and surpassed by the forces of communal organization. It is surely a positive sign that this grassroots vision of social transformation coincides with Marx's overall conceptualization of communist society as consisting of communities of freely associated producers, and is underpinned by the German theorists' mature theoretical analyses. The latter locates social domination in the whole gamut of capitalism's historically specific categories, which implies that emancipation requires abolishing not just the exploitation of workers, as the hegemonic communist movements maintained throughout the 20th century, but also the commodity forms, wages, and alienated proletarian labor in general. In the foregoing, following Marx and other theorists, we have argued that past social or living communitarian formations can help us to develop integral solutions to building the new society that overcomes the totality of capitalism's alienating categories. Importantly, however, this perspective on the past requires that we revise our approach to what in Marxism is usually known as primitive or original accumulation. Those terms, which partly refer to the process of destruction and expropriation of original communities on the way to building capitalism, must be approached differently. Progressivist or modernizing currents of Marxism have tended to see primitive accumulation, or the separation of direct producers from their labor conditions, as just an inevitable, if very painful, step toward explaining capitalist exploitation and surplus value extraction. However, this process of expropriation should be considered more carefully in ways that go beyond the progressivist, stagist narrative. In fact, Marx's ongoing work on both past and living indigenous communities, begun in the Gundris, but continuing through to the end of his life, are evidence that ultimately he adopted a more respectful, inquisitive, and affirmative perspective on the original communities that often fall victim to processes of capitalist expropriation. The key issue is that the wounds opened by the primitive accumulation through processes that continue in the present, are far from over and done with, as some have insinuated. For those committed to healing those wounds, overcoming that separation, under a new modality, current research into the separation of producers from their labor conditions should address both the larger question of the alienation that this step produces, how it spells loss of control, loss of meaning and dignity, along with, of course, laying the ground for exploitation, and also examine the possibilities implicit in revolutionary romantic approaches for maintaining or restoring the integrity of pre-capitalist formations in new modern conditions. Universal lessons? Romantic or back to the future thesis about socialist construction, and this holds true whether they're advanced by Marx, Mariátegui, Vargas, and Sanoja, Chavez, or the Venezuelan guerrilla, always raise questions related to their specificity, and hence their range of application. Are these ideas relevant to other parts of the world, not just Venezuela, Peru, and elsewhere in Latin America? As we have argued, in line with this general perspective, the building of the socialist commune in Venezuela should be greatly facilitated by both the existing indigenous communities and the persistence of aspects of a generalized communal inheritance, both in Venezuela's rural and urban cultures. Such an approach is quite convincing in a country characterized in the extreme by uneven and combined development, and in a cultural context where historical memory figures extensively in both the quotidian imagination and political discourse. But what about the rest of the world, including regions that might be lacking in these particularities? The relevance of communal traditions for other regions of the world is a question that can only be resolved through a close examination that considers their past and present specificities. In effect, the thesis leaves open the question of how socialist construction could proceed in regions poorer in community traditions, with weaker connections to the practical socialism embodied in many pre-capitalist social formations. What will their way of overcoming the totality of capitalist relations look like? Another way of phrasing the same question is, how much of the socialist commune, as it is conceived in Venezuela today, is particular to that concrete situation, and how much of it is relevant to the universal project of socialist construction? Though the relation between the general and the particular in the Venezuelan case may be difficult to hash out, a preliminary answer is that some form of community production is surely needed for socialist construction. Communities are, after all, where directly social labor takes place, if that means labor that is not mediated by the market, but by conscious and collective decision-making. Hence, the general claim is the need to have freely associated producers abolish the commodity form and the entire gamut of social relations that derive from it. However, the exact nature of the new social forms and whether they connect with living indigenous communal traditions or might be shaped by cultural holdovers from the past will depend on specific circumstances, both national and regional. The question of regional differences in building the commune is addressed in the next chapter, which deals with the Andean commune in Venezuela near the Colombian border.